Hello, my name is Tanya McIntosh and I am a piano teacher at Vincent Music, and today we'll be discussing tips on sight reading. So for a start, I would like to just clarify why sight reading is very important. So tip number one would be that we don't practice sight reading often, we practice pieces. Now, what do I mean by that? Now, when we practice pieces, we have all of the time in the world to be able to look at the notes, understand the expressive markings such as staccatos, slurs, understand what ways we can perform a certain aspect of the song and the overall song. And if, let's say, you are a piano player such as myself, we would look at the piece hands separately and then eventually put them together once we're confident. And after that, we would have full confidence in playing the whole song after a lengthy time practicing it. We normally have the pieces in front of us just as a reminder or a safeguard in case we do forget. Now with sight reading, however, sight reading asks the player to be able to play an exercise or a piece or whatever that may be on the spot. You're only given a short amount of time to sight read, and then you are expected to play at that moment. You are not given as much time as practicing pieces. So normally, because we practice pieces more often and practice sight reading very little, we end up struggling often on sight reading exercise. We often struggle to push through the pieces in the sight reading exercise. We tend to struggle on spotting what these notes are, these patterns, in that short period of time. So what does that mean then? That means that students, or every kind of player, has to practice sight reading often to get the feel of what you need to do when you're sight reading in comparison to just practicing pieces. What techniques need to be used when sight reading that is definitely going to be different from just practicing your pieces. And I do encourage students to make that a daily routine. Instead of just practicing your pieces, try to read new music often every day. It doesn't have to be an hour or two or the whole day, or all you need to do, give yourself 5 to 10 minutes just reading a new exercise, a new piece, and just playing that for that one period of time. And then the next day, do the same. Next day, rinse and repeat. That's how I would advise students to just get started on sight reading, is just to make it a daily routine and practice often. So the next tip I want to discuss is learning how to keep going while sight reading. So why do we have to keep going while playing? Well, let's look at an example. Let's say you are a pianist playing with another instrumentalist. It could be a singer, it could be a guitarist, it could be anybody, but you are playing with that person. You are not just playing on your own. And when you are playing with that person, let's say you make a mistake, okay, and you decide to stop playing. What that means is that you lose the person playing, singing, whatever they may be, and that flow entirely stops. That is why you have to keep going. And you do that by just improving your sight reading, by learning how to read better, or you being tactile and skipping a few bars until you be able to catch up with that person. And that's why in sight reading you have to keep going. So how do you learn to keep going while playing? Well, personally speaking, it comes with practice. As stated before in tip number 1, you just practice sight reading. Give yourselves 10 minutes and learn how to keep going without stopping, without processing the one note getting that note done, and then the next note, and thinking for a little bit, and then on to the next note, and so on, so forth. You may also do that with new pieces you may be learning for examinations or just for personal fun. You can apply sight reading to anything as long as it's new or it's something you haven't seen in a long time and you forgot the patterns behind it, how to play it, so on and so forth. Practice makes perfect, as I always say, so the only way to learn to keep going is just practice, practice, practice. Now, the next tip I'd like to go over is learning how to break down a task. So what do I also mean by that? Well, sight reading can be a very daunting task. You have many things to consider, such as rhythm, pitch, time signature, key signature, articulation, the pattern behind it. There's a lot to go through in a short period of time. So what I would like to do as a sight reader is break it down from something that's straightforward and then building it up to the more, difficult task. So for example, you go from rhythm to pitch, and then eventually, once we're comfortable with that, we can then have a quick look at expressive markings such as slurs, staccatos, dynamic markings, your fortes and pianos, and then moving on to the style and character of that song. So let's move into isolating the rhythm. So a way to isolate the rhythm is just to find the pulse of that piece or exercise so that the rhythm belongs to a steady pulse. So let's say, for example, we have 4/4. We'll have 1, 2, 3, 4. And from that, I know that my crotchet beats, which equates to 1 beat, can fit within that 4/4 rhythm. That's what my crotchet beats will sound like within a 4/4 rhythm. And then let's say I have to then move into quaver beats, which is half of a crotchet beat. It will be 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, and I'm using my claps as my crotchets, and then I have 1 and 2 and ones and ends that represents my quaver beats. And the reason why we have the ands is so then that we can perfectly divide the beat for our quaver beats. So knowing what a crotchet and a quaver beat sounds like within 4/4, we can have a pretty good idea of what rhythmic patterns may sound like with these two note values within 4/4. So let's say if we have 2 crotchets, 2 quavers, and then leading into another crotchet, it will sound like 1, 2, 3, and 4. And that's how I would try to isolate the rhythm, how I would try to understand what the rhythm sounds like before touching the keys within sight reading. It's just to clap the rhythm, to understand the pulse that belongs to that rhythm with 4/4 or 3/4. So another way we can isolate and understand the rhythm further is by discovering patterns and practicing these patterns. If you notice in some pieces and some exercise, so on and so forth, there are certain patterns that they use, such as maybe you have 2 crotchets leading into 2 quavers and then another crotchet, as stated before. Maybe you have 8 crotchets within a 4/4. Maybe you have something like a 4 crotchet within a 4/4 each bar. Maybe again you'll be having 2 quavers and then leading into another quaver, 2 quavers, and then leading into 2 crotchets. And you'll think to yourself, how can I clap these rhythms? How can I understand them and try to memorize them? And in that way, if you understand certain patterns that are repeated, then you have a better time sight reading and implementing your practice. So another key aspect of sight reading that we can isolate is pitch. Just understanding what our musical alphabet, what these notes are on the stave lines. Now, there are many ways you can read notes, but one way that I like to read is just memorizing your space and line notes. So things like, let's say, for example, we look at the treble clef, and we have the space notes, we have F, A, C, and E, and for our line notes is G, B, D, and F. So we learn to memorize where does our space note sit on the treble clef line, and where does our line note sit on the treble clef line. And then we can apply this again to the bass clef. And what you can do is not practice this within your practice time at home when you're practicing the piano, but you can take this everywhere. So you can try to just imagine the stave lines when you're at school, when you're waiting for the bus, when you're driving, so on and so forth, and just have a think about, where does my F note sit? Where does my B note sit? So then when you're sight reading, when you're going back to the piano, you're sitting in front of the exercise and you're trying to quickly get an idea of where all these notes sits, you have a better idea of where the note sits, like say before, and you can quickly just do that. Another way we can have a look at the notes and understanding the pitch is just looking at the pattern of movement. So specifically speaking, our intervals. So if, let's say, we come across a note that goes a note up or a note down, then we can call it steps or intervals of seconds, and we try to remember that pattern. So then when we come across it again, we can notice, that's an intervals of seconds. I know where my next note comes in, or that steps down, I know where my next note is. And there's other ways you can look at it, such as intervals of thirds, intervals of fifths. Thirds, you can call it skips. So you look at a piece and you notice that the note is having going two steps up. Let's say, or specifically speaking, a note from one space to another space, or a note from one line to another line. That is a skip. And you can try to apply this to your sight reading, recognizing that pattern of movement. So then after isolating the rhythm and isolating the pitch, we can then try to expand on other musical details. Once we have the practice done with our rhythm and pitch, once we are confident on how to understand and perform rhythm and pitch sight reading, then we can look at other aspects such as our expressive markings, your slurs and staccatos, and performing that on the spot, learning how to perform dynamic markings on the spot, and then as well moving into the style and character as we move up the level of difficulty. Understanding the tone. Does it sound happy? Does it sound sad? And how can we implement a happy and sad tone or other tone that it may want you to play? So that is the process of how you can practice and understand sight reading, and why there are certain things you need to do when sight reading. Other tips I like to recommend is understanding your keys and scales. So normally sight reading would have key signatures such as the key of C major, key of G major, and if you start early on practicing your scales and understanding what key signatures there are, C major has no sharps and no flats, A major has 4 sharps, F major has 1 flat, then you have a better understanding on how to sight read exercises and pieces. And another tip I would like to provide is listen to lots of music, every kind of music, pop, rock, country, classical, jazz, if you're going into classical, understand conventions of classical period music, romantic period music, modern period music, Baroque period music. If you listen to a lot of music, okay, you would have a better idea of certain patterns it may have, according to rhythm, pitch, so on and so forth. And the last tip I would like to give you is to make sure you reward yourself every time you sight read. Sight reading is exhausting, it's time consuming, and it's not easy. It's considered one of the aspects of music that people tend to struggle on. So I would always recommend people to be kind and reward yourself every time you finish a sight reading exercise, or you had a long period of sight reading and you deserve a meal at the end, or to watch TV or grab yourself a coffee. Just make sure reward yourself. Otherwise, you're going to become very exhausted and want to just stop immediately. Make sure that when you start, you reiterate yourself, if I get this done, if I push through, then I'll get a reward in the end. And that is it for tips on sight reading. I'm sorry if it's not as detailed as the other two videos. Just wanted to try a different format. I hope it helps, and I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to ask any questions about sight reading or anything else, please don't be afraid to contact me. I'll be very happy to help. Have a good day, and I'll see you in the next video.